think we'll get going. So good morning. Oh, sorry. I'm correcting myself. Good afternoon, everybody. When I started this, it was morning, but now it's afternoon. So good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. I just wanted to thank you all for being here, for joining us for this year's first Theory to Practice. My name is Rachael Yoshida. I am the Assistant Director for Mission Engagement at the Evans School. I am relatively new. I used to be new, but not so much anymore. I'm just really excited that everybody is joining us today. This is going to be an amazing event. We've got some amazing folks who are here to share a lot of their knowledge and experience, and hopefully give you some great things and tips and tools that you folks can take back with you that you can use in your everyday practice. And so I wanted to just kind of first and foremost, I wanted to acknowledge that we are living and working and breathing on the lands and the waters, the shared lands and waters of the Lashute-speaking people, which is the Duwamish, the Tulalip, the Muckleshoot, and the Suquamish, and that I, like many other people, through our work, our research, and our practice, make space for these Indigenous nations and peoples and other Indigenous nations and peoples around the country. So I wanted to, just say thank you again, and I wanted to turn it over to Dean Jody Sanford to kind of just introduce the series and kind of what folks can expect for the year. So, Dean Sanford.
Thanks, Lack. Yeah, so grateful that people are taking this time today to join us. I think this is a great topic we're going to be talking about, the intersection of human-centered design and public policy. And I want to just share a bit about both why this topic we're launching with Theory to Practice and what Theory to Practice is. So as many of you know, public policy is an interdisciplinary field, but I often have felt in my own journey that it has relied very heavily on social science to the exclusion of other kinds of disciplines and fields. And this is something that really has evolved in the last 40 years. There was actually, at the beginning of the Evans School of Public Policy, a scholar by the name of Richard Elmore, who was on our faculty. He's a political scientist, and in the 1980s, he wrote a paper that I have probably cited 2,000 times called Backwards Mapping. And he passed away this year. And so Dick Elmore has been in my mind, but he was challenging policy scholars at that time, saying, why are we thinking about policy in top-down ways? What if we thought about policy change from the bottom up? And what if we develop skills to do backwards mapping, is what he called. And everything about policy and implementation would be different if we put in the center of our focus the experience of citizens and those people who are interfacing with citizens at the front lines, and then thought, what kinds of supervision would we need to create the kinds of interactions we wanted? What kind of performance management systems would we need? What kind of governance systems would we need? And so I'm kind of proud that Dick Elmore was thinking about that back in the 1980s. I think in the last 40 years, people have turned their gaze towards other kinds of policy analysis tools. And to me, human-centered design thinking, but more importantly, design doing, is another way for us to go back to some of those original ideas. So I have met some of you. I joined the school in January as the dean. My own scholarship, though, has been focused on policy implementation and looking at the frontline conditions, the organizational conditions, and then the policy field conditions. And so the Evans School wants to be part of a conversation about how we might make successful and sustainable kinds of change. And when I arrived, started to think, who are the people around town or in the region that know a lot about design and public policy? And so the panel that we've assembled for you this afternoon are some of those people that I met on my journey. And in a second, I'll let Locke introduce them, but I'm really honored that they're here because they've been doing design, practice, and policy change, and give us some great ideas of how to take the concepts of design and do it in practice. And so this series that we have for alumni and friends of the school is really trying to bring up issues of theory and practice, because that's where the juice and that's where the fun in our field comes from, going back and forth in that regard. Evans is going to be a convener of many more of these conversations. We are also working with more policy partners through an initiative called the Evans Policy Innovation Collaborative, or EPIC. And so we look forward to helping you learn more about design tools and others for all the important work that you do, and just continuing to support you as leaders who are pushing fields and systems to change. So with that, Lakia, I will pass it back. And again, Krissy, Mark, and Rachel, thanks so much for joining us. I'm so excited to learn from you and have you share that with this wonderful community.
Yes. Mahalo, Dean Sanford. Again, I feel lucky to be part of the team and be part of like this work that's moving forward. And so I have had the chance to meet these folks a few times, and I have enjoyed every minute of it. I've learned a lot about what human-centered design is. And so I'd like to turn this over to them to give them an opportunity to introduce themselves, their work, and also what to them is human-centered design. And so those folks who are joining us are Krissy Kimura, Rachael Cicero, and Mark Childs. And so I'll first turn it over to Krissy. So in a few minutes, who you are, where you're at in the work you're doing, and what is human-centered design to you?
Thank you, Lakia, and thank you, Jody, for inviting me to this. I'm really excited to be here. My name is Krissy Kimura. I use she, her pronouns. I'm currently the Interim Assistant Director for the Institute for Innovation and Global Engagement, or for short, IIGE at UW-Tacoma. In the IIGE, we house two academic programs, Global Honors and the Global Innovation and Design Lab, or the GID Lab. So I'm here today to talk about my work with the GID Lab. Our aim is to always promote design thinking across the UW-Tacoma campus and community through our minor in innovation and design and through our community design thinking projects. Instead of going into definitions right away, I thought maybe a story would help. I was first introduced to human-centered design as a Peace Corps volunteer in Tanzania. I started with a community mapping exercise. The aim was to get to know my village and identify any needs in the community. After speaking with 30 people in Swahili, I had identified electricity as a top priority in my very remote off-the-grid village. Initially, I thought, hey, like, how is that going to happen? We're 27K off the grid. This is wild. But when I wrapped up my service, I had distributed over 150 micro solar kits, installed a solar panel on the local community health clinic, and had trained 3 community members as solar micro entrepreneurs. So for me, human-centered design, it works. It's collaborative, it's community-led, it focuses on the people closest to the problem. And so I'm really excited to talk about my experience and share that with you all today in conversation with both Rachel and Mark, who have great backgrounds, and I've enjoyed speaking with them already. So I'll hand it over to Rachel.
Hi, everyone. I'm really glad to be here. And Dean Sanford, absolutely a pleasure to see you and be a part of this. Excuse me, it's a little dry today. My name is Rachael Cicero. I use pronouns she, her. My role currently is Civic Designer for the Innovation and Performance team, which is a part of our local government, City of Seattle. We sort of are an interesting group. We like to sort of think of ourselves as in-house consultants, but really what we're trying to do is bring that human-centered design lens to policies, programs, services. And yes, technology might be involved in that, but I think where human-centered design has kind of been a little misguided is really sort of watering it down to the principles of, you know, just a journey map or just doing 5 interviews with someone and using that as a checklist. So I am here. What brought me into human-centered design was actually working in the private sector. So I worked at big tech. I was at Twitter during the 2016 election. and saw how very little human-centered design is actually being applied in that world. They will say they do human-centered design, but I think this is where we start to see that tension of how it's actually gone from theory to practice. And so I just really am excited to be here and to really talk about that framework and how using participatory methods can be used for things other than applications and websites. And Mark, I'm going to hand it to you.
Good morning. I'm Mark Childs. I'm a graduate of the Evans School. I'm also an architect, and for the last 28 years, I've taught architecture and ended up being the dean of the school at University of New Mexico in architecture. So I think I'm here a little bit to talk about design and the history of design. But I've worn many hats, which is why I have no hair left. So there's sort of different times when I had an epiphany about design, but I'll go back to my very first one that I can remember, which is why I became an architect. I was hiking in the mountains, and I was coming down the mountains, and I saw this farmhouse, and suddenly I could see like multiple generations of how there was the original house, and there was the addition and the next additions. And the life of that place, the people who lived there, was just so evident to me in the physical design that I wanted to be part of that. So, from my beginning as a designer, I thought it was about people. And I was astounded when people looked at it a different way. But, the roots of human-centered design are quite deep. And I'll talk about that a little bit as we go on, but I think I'll end there for my introduction.
Thank you folks for sharing and kind of giving us a glimpse into the reasons why you do the work that you do. And actually, I'll keep it going by asking Mark, okay. How did this come to be something that you not only learned but needed? Like you said, you were inspired by that, and was that as a driving force to keep moving? I mean, how did this become something that you ultimately grew into as being like a practice that you were going to apply for the rest of your career?
Right. Well, I think my schooling. I happened to be in schools that were counter to the main theme of architecture at the time. So I went to MIT and then Oregon as an architect, and they were both very much socially oriented design programs at the time. So that fed my education. But when I came out and started working here in Seattle, I worked for a firm, ARC Architects, that did I can't remember how we called it, special populations. So I worked on housing for the homeless, housing for the mentally ill, low-income housing with a number of different groups. So that was the root of my practice. And actually, but that came to the second epiphany. While I was doing this work, HUD was one of our major clients, and they kept on giving us projects that you could knock your head against them. You could do everything you could, and they'd come out okay. And so I wanted to go upstream and figure out what was happening. Why was HUD making it impossible for architects to make good housing for their clients? So that's when I went back to the Evans School and said, I want to understand policy. Why are we getting bad policy? So that was sort of my second level of this.
Thank you. Yeah, I'd love to hear a little bit about your folks. If you'd be willing to, you can share some story around how you have taken these things. How have you, like in a way that we can sort of bridge the gap between understanding the theoretical and application. Sharing perhaps like some story around where you where you've done that, use that theory and actually put into practice, something to help us ease into theory a little bit. I don't know if Rachel, if you'd like to share a little something.
Sure. I think a few of my colleagues are on here. And so we'll share the couple of pieces of work we've done at the city. But really, I think they will laugh when they hear me say this because I say it probably 5 times a day. But really for me, human-centered design at the city is getting policymakers out of City Hall. I think that is my pitch, that is my sell. That is just something I feel incredibly strongly about. And I think that part of that is making design thinking more accessible for non-designers, right? I think, unfortunately, a lot of times I think our experience with designers could be sort of egotistical in the sense of like, I'm the only one who can do this. I do not take that lens, and you really can't take that lens, especially in local government. There are people who have had many years of deep-rooted community relationships that our team hasn't established. So I think really the intersection of public policy and design for me is making sure everyone goes along, that they see the experience that's actually happening, that they're actually a part of the conversation so that they can really be rooted in what they are hearing from the lived experts themselves. I think it's hard to let go of sometimes, like you are all policy experts, but you may not be lived experts, right? I think that's a really, really important line to draw is you are really the conduit to making sort of the need and the desire and the service that makes the change. You are the conduit to actually getting that in place in a way that actually centers those with lived experience. And so this is what we try to do at the city. The story that I will tell, and I am happy to link to this after the meeting as well. So we had done pretty extensive research with 6 departments across the city in executing the Mayor Durkin's Fair Share plan and implementation. So this was for transportation network company drivers. So that's Uber and Lyft, to name a couple. So really thinking of those drivers. Now, there had been some policy that had been thought of or written and driven prior to going into community. And I think that was the moment of the city going, oh yeah, there's this thing we need to do. And it's a big thing, right? Which is going and ensuring that we know the driver voice, right? I think there's a lot of assumptions. I think a lot of the TNC companies themselves probably put data forward that we see, and we're kind of under the illusions of things like it's just a part-time gig. But when we actually went and spoke to drivers and brought drivers to focus groups and roundtables, we even had roundtable discussions with the TNC company, the companies themselves. It was actually to see, are we on the right path? And do we need to course correct? And what have we not thought about? And an example of that is a policy that was implemented last year. I believe last year, it was the deactivation centers for these drivers. That was something that came out directly from the outreach, engagement, and research that we did. And I really don't know if we would have known that that was something they needed had we not actually done the work over 3 months of really trying to reach as many drivers as possible. Those deactivation centers are actually places where drivers can go to get legal advice and legal help to get back onto the platform. I don't know if any of you have experience with those platforms, but the deactivation process is incredibly jarring. And I think being able to actually point to people and drivers saying that, can you imagine what it might be like to wake up and know that you're about to start your day and make your money, and then you get in your car, you're ready to go, and you can't turn the app on. You are literally not allowed in. We wouldn't have known that. I'm not a driver, TNC driver. The people who are making policy were not TNC drivers. So how can we get the information from the people who are actually experiencing the thing that you want to change? And I think that to me is really, really important, is that policymakers don't just need to lean on researchers and designers, they need to be with them in lockstep. And I really, that is where I will end, but I think that is just why, like I chuckle, because that's our saying, like, it's time to get out of City Hall, right? So.
Rachel, can I ask a follow-up question about
Yeah.
this example? So can you just help people understand why this wasn't conceived of as a qualitative research project, and what maybe a tool or two that you used to get deeper into the experience of the drivers?
Yes. So one of the things about being in sort of civic design, especially in local government, is you have to give up the sort of right to being the expert, or to being even the researcher who goes into the room, right? As a white woman who only speaks English, I was not the person to go that should have gone out into our East African driver population. So really why I think this wasn't necessarily seen as qualitative is because we leaned on other departments, like I said, whose sole job is to really have those relationships with community. I don't have them. I haven't been a part of innovation performance for 20 years and really have those deep-seated connections. And so I think really it's about, you know, what was so amazing is our Department of Neighborhoods actually has a program, and you can look this up. It's called the Community Liaison Program. And it's actually contractors with the city, the community members from various, you know, non-English speaking communities who really actually go out there and they helped us do this research and outreach and engagement. And so I think from a qualitative perspective, people would probably see that as more, you know, you have this qualitative research group, we're going out, we're doing this really heavy academic study. That's not what we were doing. It was really about just going and hearing directly what, like, that the policy was informed correctly in the first place. And we realized after doing that, like, they've, you know, we changed things before it was actually implemented, right? And I think that's the power, is the iterative nature of human-centered design, of it's okay to fail. And I think that's a scary word in policy and government, because if you fail, the stakes are really high, right? Look at what we saw with unemployment benefits last year. Those are high stakes. Not being able to get money during a pandemic, that's intense, right? So leaning on the people in your networks who have those community relationships, how can you help activists get into the policy space? How can you uplift them and help you do the work, as opposed to, you know, being scared or being afraid of what you're going to hear, but really using that as empowerment, honestly. I hope that answered your question, Dean Sanford.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, no, this is, I mean, this is very, very interesting. Kind of hearing about like the perspectives of this. I'd like to ask Krissy to weigh in a little bit on some of this discussion, and like, you know, seeing how these things need to be applied, and yeah, sort of like really bridging the gap between the work, like just thinking about frameworks around the work and actually doing the work.
Sure. So I think with the GID Lab, we work with a lot of different community partners, a lot of nonprofits, and I think our work with United Way of Pierce County is most relevant to this. We actually started our partnership with them in 2019 at their From Poverty to Possibilities Summit. We actually facilitated a design thinking workshop with over 150 attendees there in person, because this was pre-pandemic. And our work has continued. I think most design, it looks like a circular pattern with we follow the IDEO 5-step: empathize, ideate, prototype, test, and follow that cyclical pattern. With this project though, it's been an ongoing 2.5-year thing, and just going to meet the needs of the people that we're serving. We wrapped up in September 2 community workshops with members of the Salishan community, looking at, how to address barriers to accessing health and human services. So initially at this summit, people had prototyped, service providers had prototyped solutions to this, but going back out to the community and actually getting their feedback and saying, hey, is this actually something that will work for you? How would you address this? I think going back to what Rachel said, we're, as designers, we're the facilitators, we're not the experts or the knowledge holders. I think the Design Justice Network and their principles are really helpful, and I can drop that link in the chat too. But going into this, more facilitating and building up the knowledge of the communities. So our workshops ended up with 2 different prototypes that teams had come up with, and this information will be collated by United Way and put into a report for Governor Inslee's 10-year poverty reduction plan. So we're excited to see how that moves forward.
Hey, Krissy, can I just jump in here? So in your explanation, you used a lot of words that not all policy people know, like ideate and prototype. And so one of the things I'm wondering is, do people have to learn these really fancy words, or are there just common sense ways of understanding some of that technical terminology?
That's a great question, and also goes back to what Rachel said on making it accessible to people. We definitely don't have to be using those words. Ideate is a fancy word to say brainstorming. We really, I think from my perspective, we want to be going out to communities and using their knowledge and their ideas, their lived experiences in order to implement these changes. And so that lingo is definitely not necessary. I think we didn't even use that in our recent community workshops. We use other terminology that's more, I guess, user-friendly.
Thank you. And Mark, is there anything you'd like to add?
I want to throw in a slightly different perspective here. That's maybe not about policy well, it is. I was working in Cyprus for on a Fulbright, and I had a specific research proposal. And part of what I was doing were rephotographing old National Geographic photographs. So I went back to the site and rephotographed them. And so that was my project. But if for those of you who don't know, Cyprus has the longest standing peacekeeping force on the planet. So the island is divided in between north and south. And a lot of people were kicked out of their houses as children and are living on one side or the other and have never been back to the other side. And as I started to understand this, an opportunity came up where I took a woman. She showed me a photograph of her house when she was 12, before she was kicked out. And I walked her back to her house to do the new photograph, to do the before and after photograph. And I realized that was my job. That the big plan I had was not what the issue was. My job was to help people at that very individual, deep level go back to their homes and experience walking across that border and reconnecting. And so sometimes it's not even just the knowledge or the facts, it's that you have the problem wrong. You have your whole way of doing something isn't really what the deep level question is. And you have to be able to step back and say, wait a minute, we're solving the wrong problem. We have the wrong framework in here. Let's understand what our real goals are, what it really means to be human, and what matters here. So I want to take it a step further. It's not always just how do you get your policy implemented and how does it work out? It's really, is it the right policy? Are you even doing the right question there? So try to make it a little more complicated here.
Can I just say, that's part of, for me, why I'm so excited about having this conversation at a public policy school, because I think in the 1990s, early 2000s, policy schools thought that our job was about teaching a range of very technical analytical approaches to kind of advance a particular form of professionalism. And Mark, I think what you're saying is that, and we have lots of evidence that while there may be incredible gains that have been made on the technical understanding of some kinds of policy problems, a lot of the problems that we can have that technical knowledge about aren't actually the ones that citizens want us to have about. And that there's a lot of times that professionals may be thinking they're trying to solve the wrong problem.
Right.
And so right now, at this moment in 2021, it's really important that people in the public space and the policy space are really clear about getting a full understanding of the nature of the problems.
Right.
There was a question in the chat that David Shepard asked about what if we let people give us all this information, can we actually deliver? I'm paraphrasing. Rachel responded to part of it, but I guess Mark and Krissy, I'm curious about what do you think? Are we just going to open a Pandora's box and people are going to get even more cynical and frustrated and clear that the public sector can't do anything, or what?
It's certainly a possibility, but that's true with any project, right? No matter who you're working with, you may not be able to deliver. Or what's worse, I think, is sometimes you might deliver something that's signed, sealed, and done, but not right. So I think that it's a real issue. I think that Rachel's response in the chat of, be honest, be clear about what scope and powers that you are bringing and what you're not bringing, and what other people at the table are bringing, and feedback. And something came up. Well, explain it. That doesn't mean people will be happy, right? If your goal is to keep everybody happy, that's not going to happen all the time because there's so many conflicting goals and forces. But the other thing I want to say is that I think there may be buried in there a different issue, which is sometimes people come to the thing you're working on with entirely different agendas, right? People show up at the planning meeting in order to run for office, right? And they're not necessarily about the issue that you're talking about. They see it as a platform to build their careers, or much more complicated things where you're just the proxy war, and that you have to sort through and understand that there are bigger systems going on that you might be part of, and understand how that goes. So the issue of not being satisfied or over promising and under delivering can be very complex.
I actually think, and Margaret, I think what you're touching on as well is really the power that we bring, the power and privilege that I don't necessarily think that we are fully conscious of. And I think that when we go get data and it's very extractive, when we bring it back into a black box, that is the point in which we've already done community a disservice. And so I think this happens more often than not, is go get data, come back in, and then, hey, look what we've created for you. It really, I'm sure we've heard this has been big recently, but it's not for, it's with, right? Like we're building with the community. We're not building for them. And the same goes for policy. You're not writing policy for, like it should be writing policy with, right? You are only so aware of your blind spots. And I think that, sorry, someone mentioned in the chat about like doing this at different levels of government. The federal government is absolutely doing this. They are really, really trying to bring this sort of in a sense, digital transformation to the government, but realizing, especially coming out of a pandemic, that services need to be more accessible than just going to a counter, or not having a website break when trying to get things like unemployment. And so I really do think that power, like really letting go of that, I think makes such a big difference with community. Because if you go out there in your sweatshirt and you're not a suited up policymaker who's going out into this community, really breaking down your privilege and your power when you walk into those situations. I can't tell you how many times I have had policy folks show up in like 3-piece suits, right? Or like really expensive suits and nice watches, and we look like, we look amazing head to toe. Is that really how we want to show up to have an open and transparent conversation? I don't know how much we realize when we walk into rooms in that way. You can get bad data. You can get bad data from not actually creating the relationships with those trusted messengers and those community-based organizations. And I think where we get stuck, this takes time. I hear that so often. When are you going to be done? When's the survey going to end? When are we going to be done interviewing? There's no done. I think that's something to hold, right? That's where this idea of iteration really in my mind comes through, and being honest with that to community. We're not going to get it right the first time. That's why we're here. Maybe we'll get it right the second time, and then maybe we'll really get it right the third time. That just to add on to that, because I really think that's just something we don't realize a lot of times that we bring with us. And I think that's where community immediately gives us like the whatever, go home. So yeah, just being really mindful of that.
In the chat, Rachel Zahn asked, I think we also need to see the community-based knowledge offering as valuable, being willing to pay for the knowledge and not just expect to get it as volunteer unpaid input. Interested, do you folks have any experience with this?
Can you repeat that again, La? Sorry, I've
Sure.
not seen that.
Yeah, so she said, I think we also need to see the community-based knowledge offered as valuable, being willing to pay for the knowledge and not just expect to get it as volunteered unpaid input. So what are your folks' experience with this?
So I think that's part of the human-centered design process. Again, with our workshops that we just had recently, each of the participants from the community were compensated for their time showing up and participating. Their inputs are valued, and so we make sure that the compensation aspect is built into it. And other things that can include transportation, food.
And also just getting out of this traditional idea of compensation as well. And is it a one-off? Like, I think when we think of compensation, like, here's a gift card. What if it were more than that, right? What if you had a panel of community members who are literally coming to your meetings? They're sitting in with stakeholders, and you're paying this panel, this advisory group. And I don't want to go down this road. We have way too many committees and task forces and all of those things. That's not what I am talking about. I am legitimately talking about going into community and saying, hey, we want to build this network. We want to actually build this relationship so that it doesn't seem so extractive and one-off. Like, how amazing would it be if you were working with teens and you actually had a teen group who consistently met with you and who were consistently bringing their lived experience with them at each point of either problem solving or decision making. You have their input along the way. And so I think when we kind of freak out when it's like, oh God, you want to talk to 100 people and give them $100 gift cards? Like, no way, we can't do that. What are the other ways? can we pay them for their time, but also have them be a part of the system, the infrastructure, how we actually work? I know that's scary, but I do think actually having, being able to make government and policy more accessible to folks would do a world of good. I think we're seeing that coming out of 2020, where people said, oh, I actually have power in my local government. Oh, there's all these things I didn't know that I could do locally on a local level. And like, let's take advantage of that, right? If people want to be involved, they want transparency, they want to know how to participate in policymaking, there's the opportunity.
I want to reiterate, I think that there are multiple ways of respecting people's knowledge and compensating for that in different ways. I'm not sure that's even the right term. I've worked a lot in very small towns where there's one staff member, right? And helping a community have a dialogue. I don't know how many times I've been thanked just for that. That you're bringing an infrastructure in a way for a conversation to go forward. That can be the value that they value. It's not necessarily a one-way street here either. I mean, I've brought students to communities where there's, the exchanges in between multiple different groups, in between high school students and university students and the community and the mayor. And there's a much more complex exchange of value that's going on than thinking of it only as money. It's hard to generalize about this because I think you really have to think about what the situation is and what is it that people value. But yes, absolutely, you should avoid mining, where you go take resources from a community so that you can do whatever it is that you're doing and not be giving some respecting the value of what you're obtaining there. I'm sorry, that was a very academic answer, but it's complex. It depends on the situation. You have to actually think about who it is that you're interacting with and not, you should always compensate in a very particular way.
Yes, there are a handful of questions from folks about the use of technology in human-centered design. I'd love to hear your folks' experience using tech-based tools and solutions in your human-centered design work.
Krissy, do you want to go for it?
I was going to actually say with most of our projects, we focus on processes and different products. And so with the lab, we've kind of moved away from tech products. So I think that is a big part of it, of the work that we do. So Rachel, please go ahead and speak to your experience.
Yeah, I think, we really try to come from the mindset that technology is really the conduit. It's the channel. It's the medium in which people access your services. It's not the thing, right? For example, I think actually Uber and Lyft are really great examples of this, right? They have a driver network, but they weren't really thinking of that because the purpose of the technology wasn't to like uplift and support drivers. It was to get your food delivered to you or get a ride, right? And so I think it's really about how you view technology. And I think when it comes to anything sort of civic oriented, it cannot be tech solution going into a problem space. Like we really have to let go of, well, we can't even explore this because there's no way that we're going to have money to build a website. Who said build a website? Where did that even come from? Why are we worrying about solutions before we really even understand the problem space and the area in which we're in, or the relationships that we need to build? So I think it's a mindset, right? It's a muscle to sort of, or it's a mindset to sort of unlearn. Is sort of, yes, they're definitely, I am not anti-tech. I actually think we are not using technology for a lot more good that we could be. And so I do think that if we get into this mindset of how can technology actually aid a service, how can technology actually aid a policy, and thinking of it more in terms of the support system, or, you know, an aid or a conduit to get to something, as opposed to the thing. And I think that's just, a really, really important, because it might not always be, you know, we take a service design approach to a lot of our services at the city, because it's, you know, what are we actually delivering, and what touch points are actually going to make that more successful? That touch point could be a customer service counter, or it could be an app or our website. But how do all of those things actually work together? And I think that's where design fits in really well with policy. You have to think about it from multiple angles. And that includes bringing more people in.
Can I ask a follow-up question about this? Like, how do you do this stuff? Rachel just talked about service design orientation and touch points. Because so can you give people an example of some tools of design that designers use, that people who are more social science oriented or used to working inside government bureaucracies, that tools they're used to using, like outcome measures or theories of change? There's a bunch of tools, but what's unique about the design toolkit?
I can jump in here. I think one of the things that IDEO, the corporation that really most recently brought this to everybody's attention of human-centered design, one of the things they do really well is play. They give you a bunch of paper and have you make a model and have you remake the model. Very low-tech things of using your hands, of making forms, of representing in different kinds of ways that allow people to think things through, to have conversations, to bring their whole selves to it, not just their intellectual self, but their fun, engagement, anger sometimes, right? So I think that thinking through your toolkit so that you're doing a whole bunch of things. You have a big set of tools, some of which are very simple. A pencil, a bunch of scrap paper. I see Law nodding his head because I know he's gone through this, one of these programs where you get to play. I think that you need to be expansive about your toolkit. And not stuck in, this is the tool that I use. Because if you use any single tool, you're in that classic thing of, I've got a hammer so everything looks like a nail. It's got to be the other way around. You have to figure out what you're working on and figure out what tools are appropriate to that. I hope I answered the question. I think I may have gone sideways on it, but
I just really quickly, I had a sort of example about like melding the million different things that we all use, especially in government, all these different frameworks, right? Something that I had to learn along the way was like, don't go into those rooms and spout off all of the jargon, right? Like that works for us and makes us feel good about ourselves, but it's not a great way. It's not developing a shared language, right? So you already don't have a foot in the door. So I really encourage folks to ask their stakeholders or their clients, like, what do you know how to do already? What's your mindset? Like, what do you already you know, I try not to make people feel dumb and be like, you don't know human-centered design, you know nothing. Because it's not, if they already have these principles and mindsets, right? For example, I did a workshop, a data walk workshop. Data walk comes from results-based accountability. But we just gave it sort of this kind of equity, human-centered design lens by bringing people in to actually do the data walk. The community members, the program admins, you know, to really look at and interrogate the way in which we were collecting data, having not gotten community feedback in the first place. They're already used to that language, that terminology, that process. I have found the most spaces I win is really sort of translating design into things that they already know. Theory of change is something we talk about in human-centered design a lot. We just don't call it that. How do we get from A to B? What is the opportunity area? Where can we dig in? You know, it's semantic problem in my opinion.
Rachel, I'm going to ask you a question if I can. Have you run, I mean, we've sort of been framing this about city versus public, but have you run into the same translation issue between departments? You know, public works working with planning, or that's maybe too close.
Yes, you're talking about like shared language even between teams and departments. Yeah, and I think that is part of when we talk about relationship building, that's even bringing your own internal people along with you. And how can you do that? How can you establish like design culture or this you know, human-centered policymaking culture? And I think you do that by having conversations with people of what they already are doing. And I think bringing all of those stakeholders and saying, we are calling this 5 different things, here's what we mean. So I feel like sometimes we just like these ideas without actually defining them, right? Like what is theory what is theory change practice, right? Like it's just really, like I said earlier, it's seeing one state and getting to another state and how we get there, right? Like I could explain it in that way and bring way more people along with me than saying, you know, we're going to do this data walk. That's a part of results-based accountability. No, we're going to investigate and interrogate the data, ask some questions and see what's going on. But I think we have to equip people with that language too, right? Like I think a part of our job in this, you know, local and public space is really to be the facilitator, right? And I think that's a really different role for design and technology. Getting outside of just technology, your role is really to make those connections. It is interdisciplinary, it is across the board. Like you have to bring in people who do understand it from different lenses. I think someone had asked a question about how do you know when to use HCD and when to not? I think that is part of the process. If we get in there and we go in and understand like, oh, this isn't necessarily a design problem, but using human-centered design is more of a mindset, right? Like, what are the things that we need to do? We want to establish equity in the way in which we do recruiting. We, you know, like, what are those principles? I try to move more toward principles and mindsets than I actually do like tools and things like that. So that's very personal around what I have seen work. So that's just my lived experience.
Now, I'd like to kind of bring some thinking to this discussion around, so the idea of this is theory to practice. I wonder if there are things, what are some things that theory can teach us within all of this that we want to make sure that we cover for folks? I'm assuming these theoretical things within human-centered design that are really important to take away.
I think I already mentioned IDEO, and we've talked about that the 5 steps of well, now I've forgotten how they say them. Thinking of ideas, implementation, inspiration, right? Inspiration's first and then ideation. Inspiration is there's something intriguing that needs to happen here, or there's a problem here. I tend to like to think of it as in the positive sense. Ideation is then, what are all the different ways we can address this? And the short version is then implementation, just the three. But they also have prototyping, and Krissy, you had all 5 of them there a moment ago, I've forgotten, right? But their process of really applying that in many different venues, I think works pretty well. It's a good set of guidelines to remind you. I do have one critique of the theory, which is that, or how IDEO tends to apply it, which I don't think they go as far as they think they do in terms of it being actually involving people. So there's a little bit of, well, see a problem, you're the expert, see a problem out there, and then go ask people. Well, maybe you hear problems from people, maybe you bring them along the whole process if you're really deeply doing human-centered design.
And I also offer a theory thing here.
Yeah.
So Krissy and Mark are talking about the framework of this one consulting firm. As an academic, I don't like their framework. I use a different one. It is a little bit right that people get, the framework just helps people in the design process know where you are. Because I think when Rachel was talking about it's iterative, that can be really confusing because our brains are used to thinking in linear ways. And so I used one from a Danish guy, which I like. Mark also, though, talked about something important that I wanted to echo as well, theoretically, which is he talked about how people build things. And to me, what's fascinating about design is that social psychology talks about the importance of what theorists call boundary objects, that when you make something together, it helps you learn more about what you have in common, even if you may reference that thing differently. So somebody may see a problem and they think of it as being about institutional racism, and somebody else may see the same problem and think of it as being about a technical access problem, and many other interpretations. And what the social psychology shows is that if you can make things, materialize them, you can talk with people across different points of view and actually come to a deeper understanding of a problem, and therefore, and feel included in the problem setting, and then feel more invested in being able to develop a potential solution or generation. So I'm always really interested in like what's happening around these design tables. We've been doing some designerly work at the Evans School where we're using the mural boards because we couldn't actually be together around a table. It's not as good because you don't get to touch things and make them, but I'm always interested in how that making makes the design process a lot more, as Mark was saying, like play, but there's good social science behind that as well.
Yeah, and I think Dean Sanford, you're just touching on human-centered design comes from many different theories. I'll not shamelessly, I should say, plug. I am a graduate of the master's program in human-centered design and engineering at the University of Washington, and I will just shout out to them. They really bring that, really teach that theoretical lens, and I think it's really important because a lot of us probably come from those different spaces. And so how, again, it is bringing different mindsets and perspectives together, which can be messy. And so I think like having a set of principles, and that's why I try to say human-centered design as sort of a mindset, because if you have those principles to take you forward as sort of your like North Star or your guide, whether it's coming from critical theory or social, socio-organizational theory about how people, work with computers, it doesn't, I don't want to say it doesn't matter, but I think it's being able to be okay with, I know my lane. Like I come from this, and like here's the pros and cons of coming from sociology, coming from psychology, coming from business operations. Like, I think really knowing that in and of itself is a principle of human-centered design, is that there just isn't one way to look at it. And I think that that's really important.
Yeah, in fact, I want to kind of say, I remember this, and Krissy, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I remember when we had an early meeting and we were talking about mindset shifts and thinking about like applying and what that means. I remember, Krissy, I believe, Krissy, you shared something about mindset shifts.
I think that can be one of the most challenging things. Mark kind of touched on being playful and creating things with your hands. I think that's such a big shift though for people who do like to think linearly or are more focused on conceptual models. Actually getting something tangible or physical that people can react to and provide feedback on is a big challenge. I think it's just a different way of thinking than what we're used to or what we've been taught. And so I think that's one of the benefits of human-centered design. It puts you a little outside of your comfort zone. And it's great. Using like a tool like Mural is really fun when you're remote and virtual. We've used that to great success, but then even better in person when you have multiple clay or pipe cleaners or styrofoam that you can build on. But that has been a big challenge for us in getting people to move from a conceptual model to an actual physical prototype.
Can I throw one other approach into the mix here, which is evidence-based medicine, policy, design, which at least in how I interpret it, it's saying that you never have perfect information, particularly in an applied field, right? You never have perfect information. You have to make decisions in real time. So it's a kind of a way of thinking about how do you gather the best available evidence, but also a broad spectrum of evidence. It's not just that, we have to wait for the multiple trial, double blind, complete study of something before we can do it. You can't afford to do that, and it doesn't make sense in a lot of situations. But what is the evidence you can gather, which might include stories? It might include a whole range of non-traditional scientific evidence, but it includes, from evidence-based medicine, includes the people whose bodies you're talking about, right? As well as the medicine, as well as the practitioners, the actual doctor or nurse who's taking care of somebody. It's that full range of information. And I think the thing that I really sort of have come to in the last few years about human-centered design is we need to come to problems as full humans, not just as an architect, policymaker, or whatever our professional frame is, but as full human beings, which means we bring emotional knowledge, we bring very esoteric professional knowledge, we bring all those things to the table, but we need to bring all of them to the table and not say, oh, well, this isn't appropriate in this situation. We are full human beings. We need to act that way and bring as much of that information as we can to the table and expect other people and help other people do that so that we have a full range of available information, available evidence to make decisions with.
Mark, I want to shout that out because I actually think this is why I've found this toolkit and approach to be really important to dealing with systemic racism and institutionalized white supremacy. I think there has been a way in which formal systems have taught people of color that the knowledge that they may have as people of color is not as essential, right? It's like cut off part of yourself and come into some other world and not know what you know about community or relationships. And I think this approach says that is a really missed opportunity for helping us deal with the problems that are embedded in these systems. And to me, that's a little bit the urgency of getting our hands around this topic right now as a policy school.
And not letting the barrier be like, I can't tell you how many times I've heard like, well, what good is talking to 5 people? Those 5 people voices, they matter. Just because you can't put a probability behind it or some statistical, inference, it still matters. It might not get you to the solution, but just crediting the time you've taken to actually have real conversations with people is, I think, where we get human-centered design wrong. We put a label on how big the data has to be, and we get really bogged down in, well, if we're not going to put out information, or we're not going to put out a report if this does not have statistical significance. Interesting, because qualitative research is very statistical, and it can be, it's very rooted in being evidence-based. So it is a scientific tool, but we're not using it in the same sense that we would use a citywide survey or another more quantitative mechanism. And so I think that's also where people are like, we can't do it because we can't go talk to 100 people. We don't have capacity to do that. Why don't you start the conversation with those community leads, those trusted messengers, like the few people you can get a hold of, and then really building capacity within that community to open up the door to come in and have those conversations. I'm not inviting them, their community leader is inviting them. And I think that helps build that trust as well. And I just think, yeah, that's it's a good way to sort of think about that, so that it's not, yeah, I just like to put that out there. Sorry. I have a soapbox. I have many soapboxes that I could get on, but I will not bore you with that today.
I think that's great. I mean, I'm curious. So what are some particular challenges? Some of you've spoken to them a little bit, but what are some challenges you've faced or have seen as human-centered designers doing this work? And what are some of, if not some, kind of adding to some of the complexities that you have seen when you put it into practice?
I think I touched on some of this a little bit, but I think a big thing is just getting the right people at the table. When you're designing for community partners, you need to make sure the right voices are there, and sometimes that can be challenging. I know we just did an internal project with UW Tacoma, and even in doing some of our user research and interviews with people, it was supposed to be across the community, and it was very white and very male, which is not reflective of Tacoma. So I think that can be a challenge, and I am sure that's just a challenge with anything that we're facing. I think another thing that's been touched on too is just the design process is iterative, and sometimes these organizations come to us and we do workshops for them, and they're expecting a solid deliverable at the outset or at the end. And I think the deliverable that we're giving them is the process, and giving them this toolkit so they can go back home to their organizations and their teams and to do this with each other. And so they do develop a prototype at the end, but it's not a final product. It's something, it's that first draft, and then you go back to it and you do the process again, and then it gets better, and then it gets better. You involve more people. So I think those have been some of the challenges that we faced in working with the community. Like a minor thing too, using new software is always challenging. So I mentioned Mural earlier. Like, I love it. I think it's a great tool. We use it internally with our team. We've had great success at workshops with it, but there can always be like 1 or 2 people who are grumbly about learning a new software. Why am I doing this? Can I just use a Google Doc? What's the difference? So you'll always have people like that, but I think enthusiasm is a good way to combat that.
I have a little story. I was doing a community meeting in New Mexico about urban design or town design in towns, and so we had classic community meeting. And the first gentleman stands up, big guy, with a gun on his hip. He says, well, I think the land use plan ought to make it legal to shoot critters for food. We're like, it's a land use plan. But you know, the classic thing, you write it down on the board. Next woman gets up and she says, well, I think the land use plan ought to make it us all to vegetarians. Write it down on the board. And I'm going, what's going on here? We're not talking about any of the issues that I thought we were going to talk about, which is my principle of often people, you're part of bigger systems. You may think you're working on one issue, but the community is working on something else, or other people are working on other things. And for years, I was just annoyed by that. I was annoyed by these. And then I started thinking, well, wait a minute, what's going on? What really is happening here? What do they need to do? What are we trying to think through? And by honoring what people bring to a situation, even if it's not your agenda, I think you can often get to deeper issues. You can find how to deal with those people who are just coming to planning meetings to talk. Well, they need to talk. There's something they need to talk about. And if you understand that from the beginning, you may be able to give them a vehicle to do that. In this particular situation, we ended up doing a whole breakout thing for these two people and the communities they represented that had nothing to do with the land use. But at least from the role I happened to be in at the time, I had the scope where I could just break that off and help them through a couple of months of meetings, actually. Turned out to be an old family feud issue, right? An entirely different thing, but part of that community. It's very hard to do. You can't put it in budgets, right? But if we can think of some slack and the way to hand those problems off to the people who can deal with them, right? When I worked for King County doing community plans, I knew that if I went to the community and asked what the major issues were, the first thing that came up would be crime, and I was a land use planner. So knowing that that was going to come up, I built relationships with the appropriate people so I could hand those questions off. So trying to think of the bigger systems that people are trying to use your format for, and either being able to build in the budget or the handoffs, I think is critical.
So we have time for one more question, one more sort of big group question. And one of them is, what are ways you maintain engagement and trust with lived experience stakeholders once you collect data and reach the project?
Do you mean, is there an end?
It's a good question. I think you might have answered that, but
I think, again, it goes back to a real shift in culture. I think this idea of kind of bless IDEO, but they have commoditized design thinking. And I think that's my one criticism of them is they've really kind of watered down the theoretical side of sort of why we use this, and not as, I don't say that as a direct outcome of IDEO. I just think it's how it's been sold and distributed. And so I think it's something just to really keep in mind is, what is the kind of relationship you want to have with community, right? Do you want to be the one who just goes in, gets data, and bounces back out? Or do you want to be the one that they know who you are, right? They know, oh, Rachel at the city is going to come and help facilitate and like walk us through this process. That is a relationship. And I think when we say, oh, we're just going to go extract data and come back, that's not a two-way relationship. You know, I really think we have to think of this in both directions. Yes, it benefits us to talk to people with lived experience, but it also benefits them dramatically, right? Because if we aren't having those conversations and we give it a dead end, you know, I think someone mentioned like community task forces and things like that. Those are great, but again, I think we use them as a, oh, we'll tap into it when we need to. There is nothing preventing us from having consistent, frequent discussions and meetings with community. Mind-blowing, even outside of a project. I think that is also the problem, is we wait for this issue and we wait for this big, wicked problem. Why are we waiting? Like, just continual dialogue, I think, goes such a long way. And I actually think it does way more for building that relationship so that it doesn't seem extractive or one-off every time we go out, is that they actually know that this is an intentional process. And I think, sorry, you mentioned, like, was that just a one-off with what happened in Seattle during, you know, last summer? It may have been, but now that there's a conversation around it and seeing the action that came out of those conversations, that's where we have to keep pushing, right? Like, this is where, when I talk about soapboxes, like, not being afraid to stand on that soapbox and say, this can't be a one-off. And I'm gonna actually help my departments and teams actually establish those relationships so that they can have continuous dialogue. Yeah, that's the biggest thing for me, is that there is no end to your community involvement. I'm a little biased in that sense, but.
I think in my experience with our projects, with our community projects, I agree with Rachel. We try to engage people and keep them involved. It's a continuous process. I think at the end of a project, we do wrap up and we give a report. That's a tangible product that is handed over, but I think we keep people involved. They're along for the ride. They're on our listservs and can keep up with news from us, but then we also reach out to them. So it's not just extractive, it's a two-way relationship.
I think the only thing I would add is to make sure that it's not just personal, that it becomes, it's a horrible word, but institutionalized, that there's a relationship that the system has also, that so in you know, the city has a relationship with the community, that you're helping build that relationship and not only the personal relationship. Or in my case, not just the university or the school. I mean, not just me, but also the university and the school, because I left, right? People move on. So it needs to be a both and, I think, there, of how do you build the individual and the systemic at the same time. Harder to do.
Thank you so much. You know, I'd like to, in sort of closing, as we're coming to the end here, I'd like to ask each of our presenters here to share with us kind of a closing reflection, just a minute or two, and also, you know, provide some sort of concrete example that folks can take away, or some concrete thing, a blog, a podcast article, something that they can share that folks can take away, do you feel is important to human-centered design work. And I will start with Krissy.
Well, thank you guys so much. This was really fun. And all of the questions, I kept wanting to respond and try to pay attention, but I'm sure my email address will be passed along. But thank you for this. I think my things just to pass along would be the Design Justice Network. I think we've touched on that a little bit, but I think that's a really good resource to immerse yourself in. I will also shamelessly plug the GID Lab. I think we offer great programs, so they might be of interest as well. And then if you're still not sure, I think a really accessible book is Don Norman's Design of Everyday Things. I think it makes you feel like a genius when you're reading it. You're like, oh, I couldn't open the door. It's not me, it's the door. So those are a couple of things, but thank you so much. This was really fun. Happy and would love to participate again in the future.
Rachel.
Yeah, I would say closing thoughts. I think you all know what I'm going to say. Get your butts out of City Hall, and get out of your seats and actually go out there. I think that is, and just really feeling empowered to be able to do that. I think we all share a sense of some kind of imposter syndrome, but I really think, sure, bring in the consultant to maybe help teach you, but don't have the consultant doing the work, right? Like, go out there, have conversations. You will be amazed, like how many times we have heard, like we did research with young adults and they literally said, no one ever talks to us. Thanks for coming and talking to us. Just being there shows intentionality, right? It shows that you're willing to not just stay in the sort of bureaucratic black box, but that you're willing to actually go outside of our sort of normal perspectives and normal ways of doing and actually experimenting with something. So, getting your butts up and being really curious and being okay with some ambiguity and maybe not always being right. I am biased because I am in the civic design and tech space. I think an amazing book for everyone here to read is the Civic Technologist Practical Guide, and that's by Sid Harrell, and I can actually put it in the chat. I personally know Sid. A couple of colleagues and I actually took a course with her over the summer. And Sid is just really, really working at the intersection of research, design, and policy. She is very active on Twitter. I'll say that as well. There is a really beautiful sort of civic design and policy space on Twitter. It's actually a pretty big conversation. So I do encourage folks not to push a social media platform, but that's just kind of where those conversations are happening. So I figure I'll always throw it out there. And Kiala, I saw you said like a specific tool. That for sure is, that is literally a practical guide. Like it gives like step-by-step tools and things to do, but also just really tools that help you think of context, right? So there's a tool out there called ecosystem mapping, right? And I think that alone is one of those tools where people who are used to thinking very linearly, it actually takes them out of it by asking, who do you think is the individual using this service? Who's the family? Who's the community? What's the organization? What institutions are they a part of? What's the relationships with the institution? Are there ecological policies? Are there other things that are happening sort of tertiary to this thing we're building that we need to be aware of? And that's just one way. We're actually, I think my colleague Elise is on here, we're going to be teaching like ecosystem mapping in a workshop at the city. And so just really anything to sort of broaden your perspective. That was big for myself. Like I said, we only know what we know, right? So as many people as you can reach out to and just really expand this practice. Let's use co-design to co-design the process, right?
I'm next. I'm glad Rachel said about context. I think there's a whole set of tools about expanding your context. One of my favorite ones I tend to think of as the 3-year-olds tool. Ask why. There are management consultants who have big theories about the 5 whys and those kinds of things, but it's really the 3-year-old. Go through multiple layers of why. And that helps you see bigger systems and underlying patterns. And there are guided ways of doing it. There's a thing called causal layered analysis, which is the same kind of thing, but each layer has its own characteristic to it. So you ask, well, if this is what's going on, what's the system that that's part of? If this is the system, what's the myth behind the system, right? So it's asking the whys in a structured way. The Center for the Long Now in San Francisco actually has great resources on trying to expand your thinking. In their case, that they really want you to think in 10,000-year terms, as opposed to the next 5 minutes. But that's a different kind of contextual expansion. The other thing I want to say is that there's a long and deep history of thinking of design for people in architecture. The classic saying is from a Greek architect of firmness, commodity, and delight. Firmness meaning a good sound building, commodity meaning it's fit for the uses, it's for people in that sense, and delight is delight, right? And those are the criteria that people have talked about for a long time. There's a book from 1955 by Henry Dreyfuss called Designing for People. It's a classic that a lot of other things are built off of. And then my favorite, because I really am interested in public space, a place that people are in, look at Jan Gehl's work, Gehl. There's a Cities for People, but he has a whole bunch of tools, and he has helped make great places that are public places that really are the place of engagement, where you run into people serendipitously, accidentally, and there's that kind of synergy of that makes great places.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I appreciate everybody coming today, everybody who is in attendance. I wanted to thank Rachael, Krissy, and Mark for their time. Thank you so much for coming and sharing your knowledge and experience. And again, just want to really quickly, we will be sharing the recording. We will be sharing the resources that our presenters have provided with us, and we'll make sure to get that to you folks as well. And also we'll be sharing ways to contact information for them as well, if you want to continue connecting and learning. And so again, thank you to the team. Thank you to everybody for being part of it. Thank you, Dean Sanford, for being here. And again, like one more round of applause for Mark, Krissy, and Rachael. Thank you so much. So I hope you folks have a great day, and thank you for attending our first Theory of Practice for the year. Okay, mahalo nui.
I might have to call my dad and tell him to hang up.
Is your dad on?
Guys, thank you so much. I was tracking. We had 137 people on this call.
That's
And you
awesome.
think about, like, if we were in a room, it'd be like.
It was great. I kept checking on it, and we sent a number of reminders, and I was kind of on social, and I had some folks I knew who were just like, oh, I'll share this with folks. There might have been a few IDEO folks on here too.
Oops.
Well, because like Mark had said, I've actually done the IDEO program as a kind of let me learn, and I learned a lot from it. Of course, as somebody who's never done it, right? Especially being thrown into a room, because they have that cool prototyping room where you go in and they just tell you, they just give you like a sheet of paper that says, okay, you're trying to solve a general problem. but there's no guidance, and they just tell you good luck, right? And they give you an hour, and then you think you build something, and when you're done, they go, "We'll test it." And then you do it, and you're like, "Would this work?" And then they go, "Well, redo it, right? Or make change." Like, think of change as like as a mindset thing. So yes, it was, they might have been there because I do keep in touch with them, but in learning from you folks, I've actually learned where the kind of IDEO models ends and where the greater questions begin. And that was, for example, not part of that process. So,
well, great job moderating, and thank you all again for representing. It was so fun. Kayla and I were in the background watching the chat and recording lots of questions that didn't get answered. So we might send a few of those your way. We'd like to early next week compile all the resources that you all named. So if you think of anything over the weekend that you want to make sure we send out as well, feel free to send that to Laakea, and we'll add that in. We'll send the recording and all of a list of those. So just so grateful that you spent your Friday noontime with us, and all the prep that goes into this, I know. Anything, Jody, that you want to offer in closing?
Well, I just want to be explicit in saying that it is not our intent to mine your expertise, but we hope this is the
Very good.
continued depth on our relationship, right, as an institution with you, and
Yes.
partnering and supporting and shouting out your work and all of that.
Yeah, absolutely. So anything that you would like promoted, make sure that Laakea has a link, and we'll send that out as well.
Thank you all.
yeah, thank you.
I learned a lot.
Get in touch with the HCDE department, please. They need this lens in it. Like, Jody, call up Tyler. Tell him I, sent you after him. And
Yeah, Rachel, actually send me his contact. I tried to do some poking around with the dean. She's new there, and she was like, "What are you talking about?"
Yeah,
So.
you won't get. Yeah, I actually already spoke about you and the Evans School to Tyler, so he might actually have more context than Julie will have. So I'm happy to do that. Make that intro.
Cool.
Okay, La, anything
Brain
else?
trust. It's amazing.
I'm muted. I have a great tendency to be muted when I start talking. No, I appreciate all of your folks' time and energy. I appreciate your knowledge and what you've been able to share, and being so gracious and meeting with me and having conversations and wrapping my head around it. As somebody new in the school and getting a sense of the work and being part of the team, I'm very happy. I feel like it's been a great event and got a lot of it. I've learned a lot from it, so I will share that. And that I think I would like to make sure that at some point here in the nearer future, if people are comfortable, I'd like to meet you for coffee at some point to just get to know your folks' work better and be a conduit for like your work as well. So it's all I really have to share. So so mahalo nui, mahalo to you folks for all of your work and dedication. Thank you.
Awesome, thanks.
Nice to meet
Thank
you.
you.
Right. Aloha, everybody.